When it comes to the Saints Row series, especially with the earlier games, it's a pretty beloved series. And while nowadays Saints Row definitely isn't up to the level of popularity that it originally had, over the course of the franchise history, there were over 10 different projects that were worked on that ended up getting canceled and never saw a full release. From handhelds to ports to full-blown sequels, we're going to be going in depth on every single canceled Saints Row game. Starting with the canceled PSP Saints Row. After the success of Saints Row 1 and Saints Row 2, Volition aimed to make a port of the then popular Saints Row 2 game, but for the PlayStation Portable. You see, while Saints Row 1 originally was an Xbox 360 exclusive game, Saints Row 2 made the jump over to the PlayStation 3 and Windows thanks to the help of Mass Media Games. And early on in development for the PlayStation Portable title, Mass Media Games was tasked with this project. However, during the earliest development and conceptual stages of this game, plans quickly shifted and this game would be spiraled into a game of its own with its own unique story. So with that plan in mind, Volition shifted the development over to a different studio known as Savage Entertainment, and they had more experience developing PlayStation Portable titles, so it made sense. So with the plan of it being a Saints Row port turning into a new individual and unique game, at one point in development, this game was titled Saints Row The Fall, and plans for the story would have originally taken place sometime between the events of the first Saints Row game and Saints Row 2. This would mostly make sense because at the end of Saints Row 1, the game ends on a cliffhanger, and Saints Row 2 starts off after many years. Players learn that the Saints are no more. This PSP title, called Saints Row The Fall, likely would have followed the story of the collapse of the Saints, though that's mostly just speculation here, as there's not too much known about what the original story was. During these early development stages, it seemed like Saints Row 2 ended up becoming way more popular than anyone expected, and Volition changed direction again, this time wanting the Saints Row game to shift to be a sequel to the existing Saints Row 2 game. According to the website Unseen64, Saints Row PSP would have had players take on the role of an undercover cop who joins the 3rd Street Saints just in a time where the Saints split into a civil war. But towards the end of the game, the player character, who's this undercover cop, would end up betraying the police and joining up with the Saints permanently. One thing that's really interesting though is this game would be changed in titles again, this time to Saints Row Undercover. Now, Saints Row Undercover was originally planned as a game to be similar to the Grand Theft Auto series on the PSP. It aimed to retain the core gameplay elements of the Saints Row series, including that over-the-top action, the open world, character customization, and cooperative multiplayer. The game was set to have 20 main story missions along with the familiar side activities that Saints Row was known for at the time, and this game actually was in development long enough to have a playable prototype developed for the game. But after several reviews, Volition felt that the game did not meet their standards for what a Saints Row game should be, and the project ultimately would end up getting canceled. But what's really interesting is years later, a Volition employee named Josh Stinson, who worked as an associate video editor, stumbled upon a PSP dev kit while exploring the office, and he shared the discovery with some other people at the office, and the team at Volition decided that they should show off what this game would have been like, as at the very least this canceled game was worth having some form of preservation, and fans were really excited just to see what the game would have been like. In January of 2016, Volition live streamed on Twitch Saints Row Undercover, showing for the first time what the game would have had to offer. And there was a rare internal design document that was also released, revealing the full plans and extent for what this game would have been. They even released the ISO file so fans would be able to go and play the playable prototype themselves, which is something completely unheard of. We looked through all these files pretty extensively for this video, and there is some really interesting things here. As for the world, this game would have had Saints Row 1 and 2 City Stillwater reused once again, with assets from Saints Row 2 used as the bulk of the game's template, but they would create a lower poly, smaller texture world to best work with the platform. There would be some small revisions though made from the Saints Row 2 version of the map, reverting certain sections back to how Saints Row 1 handled the map, just to trim down the overall scale. And some interior locations, such as gun stores like Friendly Fire, would be reduced from an actual location you could walk around to just a UI menu where you could buy stuff. Characters like Johnny Gat, Shondi, and Pierce would return. Even Deputy Chief Troy would be back as well, along with some new characters as well. In the opening missions of the game, a new gang would have rolled up on the 3rd Street Saints, led by someone named Lady Ranja, and with a ton of fighting in the streets, Commissioner Troy Bradstreet decides he needs a mole in the Saints to try to reunify the gang, and since no current officer in Stillwater wants to be involved, they look at a police academy of new trainees for a potential person, and that's where the player, who is this undercover officer, gets picked from. There'd be 2 levels where you were in the academy still, which would have served as like training levels teaching you how to play the game, and then the player would join the Saints by essentially following some leads and then having to win a 5-man fight to the death in a park, and from there they meet Johnny Gat. Wow. From there the story would still retain a lot of the original Civil War plans that they had for Saints Row The Fall that would have been between Saints Row 1 and 2, except some of them just play out during this game instead. Some Saints would end up turning on the rest of the 3rd Street Saints, joining up with Lady Ranja. And then of course at the end, the player's faced with the decision to stay a cop or become a saint, and he chooses to become a saint. From this design document, it appears that the whole script was fully written and approved, though it doesn't quite look like the prototype build of the game had gotten the full story elements implemented yet. Then the design document has a bunch of talk about co-op and how AI mapping will work for vehicles and pedestrians and whatnot. It looks like there was also a ton of thought put into what character customization would look like and vehicle customization. I mean, these obviously are concept images, but it's kind of impressive how much they were planning on going here. But honestly, reading through this design document that's 122 pages is a pretty interesting read. It seems like a lot of Saints Row ideas were fully fleshed out, and this game intended on being as closely on par to what Saints Row 2 was, for example, like, with only cutting out things that absolutely had to be cut down. Even the parts like sound design, where there was some concern about how they were going to have diversity in the way that sound came across in the game, it seemed like it was written out in a way that was thoroughly thought through in an attempt to minimize a loss in quality from a handheld version of a game. I think it's a real shame that this game never actually ended up seeing a release. Now, it does seem like the concept for this game, though, stayed alive a little bit longer than a lot of people may have noticed. While there isn't a lot of details as to what happened next in regards to Saints Row, the fact that to an extent this game was playable sometime in 2009 has led many fans to believe that there were intentions for this game to eventually be reworked and re-released, though on the Nintendo 3DS. E3 2010, Saints Row Drive-By was announced, and this would have been a 3DS title that now would have been the first handheld title in the franchise. Many fans speculate that with the PlayStation Portable getting older and the 3DS technically being the new jump for technology, at some point in development, perhaps Volition thought that this Saints Row game would work better on the 3DS and a new title would be announced, though nothing really ended up coming from that. There's also some confusion though, because it appears at some point Volition even stated that they planned this game to have an Xbox Live Arcade port and a PlayStation Network port as well, though it could be confused with another title that we'll talk about shortly. Now, we don't know too much about the 2010 3DS Saints Row Drive-By game announcement. All that they said was that the game would still take place in Stillwater, despite the fact that Saints Row the Third, which was coming up for the following year, would already shift away from Stillwater and be taking place in Steelport. This led even more fans to speculate that that PlayStation Portable game Undercover was just that game being shifted to the 3DS for Drive-By. But 2011 saw another announcement of a pretty interesting game known as Saints Row Money Shot. Now, this would have been allegedly an on-rail arcade shooter for the PlayStation Network and Xbox Live Arcade, originally aimed to cost around 800 Microsoft points, or about $10, but plans were later changed where this title would have been free. This wouldn't be the first time an arcade game would be released to promote a main game release during this time. Like, for instance, Fable 2 did like these pub games as like a little arcade game to kind of promote the main release of Fable 2. So perhaps this is what Saints Row Money Shot was aiming to be. There was a little text flare released about the description description of what this game would have been. You are a Cypher, a deadly assassin in the world of Saints Row, and you hunt the most elusive targets with the most sophisticated weaponry that Altor has to offer. How sophisticated? You have the ability to control the path of your bullet to such a degree that you can weave through the hallway of an apartment complex, steer through the legs of a hooker, and even snake your way through a moving train. Avoid striking solid objects and unintended bystanders, and make sure you hit your mark. That's honestly a pretty accurate description, I think, of what this game would have been like. It was an on-rail shooter where you controlled the bullet of a gun. And actually, like, from leaked gameplay footage that did release of this game, it kind of looked like a fun game, almost more of like a puzzle type approach to a game, but still something unique and interesting that could have easily worked within the Saints Row universe. We don't have too much information as to why this title was scrapped. Perhaps they needed to put more resources on Saints Row the Third, which was coming up, and I guess that makes sense, but still, it's kind of a shame we missed out on this one. While there wasn't ever a full-on Saints Row money shot, they did release a DLC pack for Saints Row the Third called Money Shot Pack DLC, but it had nothing to do with this little on-rail game. Now, there was another interesting game that was also canceled before the release of Saints Row the Third called Saints Row the Cooler. This would have been made in partnership with THQ, with the development studio Heavy Iron Studios, and had a team of around 40 people working on this project. The catch? It was supposed to be a darker, grittier Saints Row brawling game that utilized the Xbox 360 Kinect and the PlayStation 3 Move. Now, this game would not be an open world game, and it would just be a brawling type game that would have had combat mechanics like well-timed blocks, kicks, and punches performed by the player, and the game would shift in and out of first and third person based on when you were fighting. There was also going to be some other spin-off things in the game, like other activities besides just fighting that you would be able to do as a player, like poker tournaments, mini games, lap dancing with a Kinect. Wow. Though through Unseen 64's reporting, this project was worked on for about 6 months and was about 60% complete at the time of the development getting canceled, and one member of the development crew citing quality concerns as the reason the game ended up getting canceled. Now, this game never actually got an official announcement, so the public didn't know about it for a long time. It wasn't shown to the press in any way whatsoever. Not much was even known from the public for quite some time. However, on Unseen 64, it was reported that one of the former animators claimed to them that the developer retained some of the project assets and used them in another project, UFC Personal Trainer, the Ultimate Fitness System. Since that game was also being developed at the same time as Saints Row the Cooler, it's possible that some of the motion control framework was reworked and used in this other game, which also uses punch, kick, block mechanics. It's a real shame this game ended up getting canceled despite the fact that it would have been a Kinect or PlayStation Move game. I feel like having a game that had a fun, lighthearted narrative mixed with a grittier and more action-oriented gameplay could have still been really fun, especially since this still would have kind of followed the more gritty art direction that Saints Row 2 and 1 were kind of known for. Okay, but next, there was another Saints Row game that I think a lot of you probably didn't know about. Saints Row Wii. Oh boy. Now, this one's actually a little bit older than some of the ones we're talking about, but it's a shorter one, so we just put it here in the video instead. But in the earlier stages, when the first Saints Row game was being developed, the one that came out as an exclusive on the Xbox 360, there were plans for a Wii version of this game, which would have been developed by Mass Media Inc. It's speculated that the game would have played out mostly the same as the original Saints Row game, but with maybe lower resolution and less graphical detail, and was likely canceled due to porting problems, though there are a couple of screenshots, also on Unseen 64's website, from the Wii prototype, and it's of 2 buildings. But I mean, they look like this, so that's cool. What about the canceled Saints Row movie starring 50 Cent? Did you guys know this was a thing? I didn't know about this until I started doing research on this video. Now, we all know 50 Cent did have his own game series, and back in 2009, when he was promoting his new game, he was in a conference call. 50 Cent stated that with his relationship to THQ, they'll actually see him develop Saints Row into an actual screenplay and a film film project. He even said, "I'm optioning the rights for that right now, so they'll see that before they see me do it from my own perspective for the game." Even more so, in 2010, just a year and a half before the release of Saints Row the Third, Danny Bilson, who is THQ's executive vice president of Core Games, said that the publisher intended to do a Saints Row film that he hoped would launch the same day as the third Saints Row game, and that a major filmmaker would be involved. That never actually ended up coming into fruition. Where's our 50-cent Saints Row movie? I'd like to see it. Okay, and then I was unsure whether or not to count this one, but we're gonna throw it in here also. There was an extra storyline option for Saints Row the Third, where typically you get to pick between like 7 different voices in your character creation, and that will play as the voice for the main protagonist character. There are plans to have a full-on auto-tune option where your protagonist would say everything in an auto-tune voice. However, this idea never ended up happening, and instead they used it just for the character Zemos. Okay, but there's still another large game that was originally intended to release that never got to actually be made. This game was known as Saints Row Prime, or also Saints Row Part 4. But it's not the Saints Row 4 that you guys know that did release. This would have been a full-blown, unique sequel to Saints Row the Third that wouldn't be just built off of all of the stuff from Saints Row the Third in the way that the actual Saints Row 4 was. Saints Row Prime began development shortly after the release of Saints Row the Third, but also coincided with THQ's financial struggles. The game would have taken place in a brand new city and would have been a direct continuation to the events of Saints Row the Third, and this time around, the story would focus back in on Johnny Gat, who was killed in the previous title, just like Saints Row 4, but he would be brought back to life through cloning. The problem is, the clone of Johnny Gat would have ended up being evil, and he would have gone to resurrect other notorious historical figures who were evil as well, like Genghis Khan, Cleopatra, and Joseph Stalin, and then they would become the gang leaders in this new city. The game would have introduced new mechanics, including a dedicated cover system and a parkour system, which had been attempted in previous Saints Row games, and a more extensive weapon customization system with attachments. Now, unlike the final retail version of Saints Row 4, there would have been no superpowers in Saints Row Prime, but man, this version of the game would have been pretty cool. It seemed like there was concept art made for what some of the locations or like the headquarters for the different gangs led by Genghis Khan, Cleopatra, and Joseph Stalin would have looked like, and it's kind of badass. So why did this version of the game end up getting canceled where we got Saints Row 4 instead? The cancellation of Saints Row Prime was primarily due to THQ's desire to release a game that would generate sales and help the company's overall financial situation. Instead of proceeding with this Saints Row Prime idea, THQ decided to transform an existing Saints Row project, which was originally going to be a story expansion for Saints Row the Third called Enter the Dominatrix, and just turn that into a full-fledged game in the form of Saints Row 4. The development team quickly adapted and incorporated new elements such as superpowers and increased references to sci-fi and pop culture, and obviously you can see the themes of The Matrix, which the Enter the Dominatrix thing was a play on, play out in a pretty massive way in the real release of Saints Row 4. Another reason that this Saints Row Prime title ended up getting canceled was just the substantial amount of work it would require to create another game from the ground up. Considering the next generation of consoles would be released around the same time, it wouldn't necessarily be financially wise to launch a brand new game for outdated hardware, especially if it meant they would lose the launch window of releasing before Grand Theft Auto 5 would release. As a result, Saints Row 4 recycled numerous assets from Saints Row the Third, given its origins as just DLC, and obviously deviated significantly from the story and plot ideas originally pitched for Saints Row Prime. Despite all this, Saints Row 4 did manage to release before the release of Grand Theft Auto 5, which seemed to be the biggest goal here, and while it wasn't a true to form Saints Row game, it was kind of a fun, like, superhero Saints Row inspired game. Nowadays, there's no playable version for the ideas that would have been in Saints Row Prime, though remnants of these concepts could be found in assets from E3 versions of Saints Row the Third and pitch videos created for internal use. These materials would actually be showcased during another one of Volition's developer live streams, so at least to an extent we got to learn there were at one point plans for a very different Saints Row Part 4. For the most part, that's everything we have when it comes to the canceled titles of Saints Row. During the early development stages of the Saints Row reboot that we recently got, there were ideas to possibly retcon some of the storyline elements at the end of Gat Out of Hell to make the reboot game a full-on sequel or continuation of the Saints Row story, but it seemed like very quickly on the decision was made to just do a fresh reboot, and that ended up being for better or for worse. So what did you guys think of this video? Do you wish any of these Saints Row games got made? I was actually really impressed with that PlayStation Portable game, with how far along it ended up getting. Those portable GTA games were actually not that bad, so a game like this could have potentially done really well. I think there is something to be said about Saints Row games and the fan base. I think while Saints Row the Third kind of got that perfect mix of over-the-top comedy and a serious tone, recreating that charm isn't anything easy with, as we can tell, the Saints Row reboot game. I think they should have gone for a little bit of a grittier tone, more like Saints Row 2 to start out, and kind of set the basis for the game series, but it's a little too late now. Time will tell what people think about the new Saints Row reboot as its lasting legacy within the franchise moving forward, so ultimately we'll have to wait and see. But hey, if you liked this video, you want to see more videos on canceled games or older games from like that Xbox 360 era that's kind of like nostalgic now, make sure you subscribe to Rocket Sloth for more videos just like that. We cover all types of things, so it'd be cool to have you on board with notifications on. Huge shout out to our patrons for supporting our channel, making videos like this even possible. But otherwise, that's it for today. We'll see you all next time with a brand new video.